In this week's Parashat Balak, the parasha starts off with the evil king Balak ben Zippor hiring that non-Jewish Navi, that prophet Bilaam, the evil Bilaam, to curse the Jewish people. Now Hazal tell us this evil Bilaam, he had kochot, he had certain powers to him. In the very last parak in the Midrash Sifri on Bezot HaBeracha, so Hazal tell us that Velo kam Navi od b'Yisrael keMoshe. At the end of the Torah tells us, Bezot HaBeracha, that there was no prophet, Velo kam Navi od b'Yisrael keMoshe. That nobody arose amongst the Jewish people like Moshe. Says the Midrash, but look what the pasuk says. V'lo kam navi od beYisrael. BeYisrael lo kam, aval be'omot ha'olam kam. He says, yeah, amongst the Jewish people, it's true that there was no other navi that arose, but amongst the umot ha'olam, the non-Jewish nations, there was another navi, there was another great prophet amongst the non-Jewish nations. Ve'ezezen, who's that person? Ze Bilaam ben Beor. That is Bilaam. So in a certain sense, we see Bilaam is being compared to Moshe Rabbeinu. We had the one and only Moshe Rabbeinu. You think there's nobody else out there? Yeah, amongst the Jewish people, there's nobody like Moshe. But amongst the umot ha'olam, there's somebody with a certain spark, a certain koach, that's similar to Moshe Rabbeinu. So too, if you open up Bimba Rabbah, this is in Perik Dalet Siman Kaf, Ubevo Moshe al Oel Moed diber ito, and Moshe Rabbeinu would come into the Oel Moed. Hashem would speak to him. Tane, teach the rabbis. The pasuk says, "V'lo kam navi od b'Yisrael keMoshe." B'Yisrael lo kam, ve'omot ha'olam kam. Similar to our Midrash Sifri says Bimidbar Rabbah, that by Yisrael there was a special Moshe. By the non-Jews there was also a special prophet named Bilaam. Now here the Midrash explains why. What's the reason why Hashem gave the non-Jews such a holy prophet, even though he's so tameh and he's so evil? We're going to see in a couple of minutes, but he still had certain prophecy levels that were so high, similar to Moshe Rabbeinu. Why? So there wouldn't be a pitchon peh. So there would be no argument by the nations of the world. There'd be no recourse in saying, oh, do you know why we didn't follow you, God? Do you know why we weren't on the right path? Do you know why we weren't Ovdei Hashem? Because we didn't have a Navi like Moshe. But if you would have given us a Navi like Moshe, we would have been of Ovdei Hashem. It says the Midrash, Ve'eza Navi hayalem. Who was their Navi Kim Moshe? Who was it? Ze Bilaam ben Beor. So they were given this Bilaam ben Beor, so they would at least have the possibility, so they wouldn't have an excuse anymore to say, we didn't know better, you should have known better, because you had a Navi like Bilaam, who Bilaam by the end of our parasha is going to let us know very clearly how great the Jewish people are and how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with us. Okay. Then the Midrash discusses three differences that make Moshe's prophetic abilities far greater than Bilaam's. It speaks about how Hashem spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu peh el peh, and then the Gemara goes on to say that there are 2 to 3 areas, depending on which Tana is speaking, a little bit of a machloket, where Bilaam's prophecy seems from a certain angle to be even greater than Moshe Rabbeinu's. Ayin Sham, how that could even be. Okay, so in this week's parasha, we encounter Bilaam's prophecy in the text of the Torah, and the curses he had wished to utter against the Jewish people, but miraculously, every curse he's about to utter gets changed over by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Na'apochu, it becomes the beracha, and he blesses us, and then blesses us again, and then blesses us again. Last week in Parashat Chukat, by the episode by the rock, by the Sela, we saw that according to the opinion of Moshe Wolfson, that Moshe Rabbeinu's mistake was not using his dibur to speak to the rock, and it stemmed from Moshe's greatness, that he was such an anab, he was the greatest anab that ever lived, he was so humble. But he says at Moshe Rabbeinu's great level, there was a certain level of misplaced humility. He felt he didn't have the right to do dibur over here. As we mentioned, the Moshe Rabbeinu was kavad peh, it was hard for him to speak, and he felt that maybe this is not supposed to be his role. He's only supposed to be a mateh, he's only supposed to be this messenger of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Dibur is too great for Moshe Rabbeinu, and it was a misplaced anava, according to Rav Moshe Wolfson. But if we look now in our parasha, by Bilaam, it's the exact opposite. Bilaam is more than ready. He's quite enthusiastic. He wants to curse the Jewish people. He wants to use his dibur, but now Hashem is going to show him how dibur really works. First, from the tochacha, from the rebuke he's going to receive from the piaton, the miraculous mouth of Bilaam's donkey that's actually going to speak to him and give him rebuke, and then directly Hashem is going to show him by controlling his actual words. When he opens up his mouth to give a klala, he opens up his mouth to curse the Jewish people, only berachot are coming out. Bilaam's dibur will only be used if he's going to bless the Jewish people, and Hashem is making that clear. Okay, so now we have ourselves the brachot of Bilaam, although Hazal also tell us, they warn us that the brachot of the Reshaim, that's pretty dangerous too. It says in the Ta'anit, Daf Kaf Amud Aleph, says over there, Amar B'Shua Bar Nachman Amar B'Yohanan, Mai Dichtiv, what does it mean in the pasuk that says, Ne'emanim Pitzei Ohev, V'na'atarot Neshikot Soneh? What does it mean when it says that faithful Ne'emanim are the wounds, the psaim, the pitzei, Faithful are the wounds of someone who loves you, of a friend. V'na'atarot neshikot soneh, but the kisses of an enemy, that's deceitful. That makes balagan. That makes problems. So what's that talking about? So explains the Gemara. Tova klala shekilel achi shiloni d'Israel. Greater, better, more effective, more proper. It's tova, the curse that Achia Shiloni gives to the Jewish people. He cursed us to fall down like a reed, like a kaneh. That's greater. You'll tell me bracha shirachan Bilam Rasha. That's even greater than the bracha of Bilam Rasha. He's going to compare us to an errors. We'll get back to that later on in the Dvar Torah. But he's saying even when we have a bracha from Bilam, it's still much more kasheh for us. Problems are going to happen even with the brachot of the Rashaim. But nevertheless, our parasha still contains the brachot of Bilam. It contains them at length. The majority of the parasha is dealing with the prophecies of Bilam, and many of his prophecies we use as part of our tefillot. Ma tovu olecha Yaakov. We take his language, and it's cryptic, it's poetic, it's prophecies, messianic ideas are in over here, and it's written about at length in our parasha. So we see that it actually becomes part of our Torah. His prophecies are part of Torah proper. And even more than that, Hazal even tell us that they initially had a thought, they have a hava amina, that we should take part of his, pick this whole section of the Torah and make it part of our tefillot, say it together with the Kriyat Shema every night and every morning. If it wasn't so long, we would be saying it. There's such levels of holiness and kedusha to it. Okay, so in this Dvar Torah, I want to focus on a Gemara that attempts to understand how exactly does Bilam's prophecy find its place into the text of our Holy Torah. How could the prophecy of such a tameh person, of a rasha, and as our Gemara said, that the brachot of a rasha, it's not going to always be the best for us. How does that make it into the actual Torah itself? And actually, we're going to see B'ezrat Hashem a lot more in these words of the Gemara. So says the Gemara, this will be the focus of the Dvar Torah right now. Says the Gemara in Batra, Daf Yud Dalet Amud Bet. The Gemara over there is attempting to give the timeline of when the different Sfarim that make up the Ketuvim were written. And much of the debate actually surrounds the dating of the Sefer of Iyov, of Job. We're beginning, we're going to have a Shabbat Sarat Tammuz happening right after Shabbat, and then we're going to be getting ourselves ready for the 3 weeks, getting ready for Tisha B'Av. We're going to read about Iyov, a depressing book, a somber book, a book about theodicy, why do bad things happen to good people, but ultimately a very deep philosophical book to be reading on Tisha B'Av to recognize what the bigger picture is with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. So much of the debate in the Gemara over there in Bava Batra is discussing, okay, when did it happen? What generation was it in? Did it even happen? Is it only a mashal? And at one point, the Gemara goes according to the opinion that Iyov lived in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu. And then after that, it pivots to discuss, okay, then who wrote the numerous books of the Tanakh? So ask the Gemara, Umi Ketavan, and who wrote it? Who wrote the Torah? Moshe Katav Sifro Parashat Bilaam v'Iyov. So it says Moshe wrote his book, or it sounds like we're going to start with the Sefer Torah, on the simple level he wrote the Torah, Parashat Bilaam, and the Parasha of Bilaam, v'Iyov, and the book of Iyov. So according to this Tana in the Gemara, according to this opinion, Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the Torah, he wrote Parashat Bilaam, and he wrote the book of Iyov. And then it goes on, Yoshua Katav Sifro, Yoshua wrote his book, Ushwana Pesukim Shabbat Torah. He also wrote the last 8 Pesukim that described the death of Moshe Rabbeinu. Actually, that whole last part of Yoshua writing the last 8 Pesukim of the Torah, that's also an awesome topic. B'ezrat Hashem, maybe we'll get back to it in the future, because the Gemara is going to go on to say that Moshe also wrote it, but he wrote it with tears. So what are these 8 Pesukim? There's a lot of deep stuff over here, B'ezrat Hashem. It's not our topic for today, but B'ezrat Hashem, the Od Chazon Moed, maybe we'll get back to it. Okay, but let's get back to our part. So says the Gemara, let's look at the words clearly. It says, our Gemara says, Moshe wrote Sifro, he wrote his book. Now, according to the simple interpretation, we're going to see others in a second, but according to the simple interpretation, his book, Sifro, is referring to the Torah itself, and the Torah itself is known as Torah Moshe, and then he also wrote the Parasha of Bilaam. Okay, and Iyov. But what does it mean that he wrote the Parasha of Bilaam? What does that even mean? Didn't Moshe Rabbeinu write the whole Torah? This was bothering all the commentators. Moshe wrote the whole Torah. He wrote Sifro. So part of Sifro includes the Parasha of Bilaam. Now again, we can debate the last 8 Psukim. Can he write about his death or not? That's a different theological question about the last 8 Psukim. But the Parasha of Bilaam, right now, towards the end of Sefer Bemidbar, Moshe Rabbeinu is alive, he's writing it, and he's well. So that's part of the Torah. What do you mean he wrote the Torah and Parashat Bilaam? Parashat Bilaam is part of the Torah. It's part of Sifro. What in the world is this Gemara talking about? So says Rashi. Let's start with Rashi. Rashi says, Parashat Bilaam, Nevu'ato u'mashalav, Afa pisha enan sorchei Moshe v'torato seder ma'asav. Okay, these are the words of Rashi. He says, what is Parashat Bilaam? It's the prophecies of Bilaam, Nevu'ato, u'mashalab, and his numerous parables. Af al pi, even though Moshe Rabbeinu wrote them down, even though she'einan tzorchei Moshe v'torato v'seder ma'asav, even though they're not part of the needs of the tzorchei Moshe, the needs of Moshe Rabbeinu, his Torah, and the seder ma'asav, the order of his deeds, I guess like the chronology of what takes place and the actual storyline. Meaning, it sounds like that the Parashat Bilaam is not necessary for the greater needs of Moshe and the Torah. Yet Moshe Rabbeinu still writes it down. So we have ourselves the Torah that's needed. It's the Tzorchei Moshe. It's what Moshe feels is necessary. And Bilaam seems to be this parsha that's not necessary. It's not on this level known as Tzorchei Moshe, V'Torato, V'Seder Ma'asav. It's not on this level, but Moshe Rabbeinu still writes it down and adds it to the greater Torah. Okay. But many of the Mefarshim are very bothered with this Rashi. What do you mean that it's not part of Tzorchei Moshe? So let's look at this question is really brought down in many places. Let's look at it from the approach of the Shlach Kadosh. Says the Shlach Kadosh, V'teima, it's a big question here. V'chi yesh ot achad b'Torah she'eno Torah? Is there even one letter in the Torah that's not Torah? Halo parsha Bilaam k'tuva b'Torah. Bilaam is written in the Torah. V'im ken ma'u ze shamar katav sifro u'parashat Bilaam. So what in the world does it mean that he wrote his book, he wrote the Torah, and he wrote the Parsha Bilaam? Bilaam is part of the Torah. Like, what are you talking about? The Rashi Katav is it? Then he quotes Rashi that he wrote the prophecies and the parables, even though it's not Tzarchei Moshe, the Torah Tosed Masav. He says, "V'lo zachiti la'avin divrei harav pe'ah kadosh." Says the Shlach Kadosh, I wasn't zocheh to understand what the holy lips of Rashi is saying. I don't understand what he's saying. Halo kol hasipurim shebat Torah kemo harigat kain lehevel lechotzeh bahen einam nechor tzorach Torah b'seder ma'asav. He says, once you're going to tell me that the story of Bilaam is not like a necessary story, so then do we have to know about the story of the murder of Kain and Hevel? Do we have to know about the other stories that take place? All that also isn't Tzorach Moshe. So why all of a sudden is our Gemara telling us, Parashat Bilaam, that's like the one parsha in the Torah that doesn't seem to fit. That's like not Tzorchei Moshe. Every other story, we can fit it in. All the book of Bereshit, we can fit it in. But Parashat Bilaam, this seems to be something off over here. He says, Aval kula Torah Hashem temimah. He says, everything is part of Hashem's perfect Torah. K'mo shekatuv. And then he says that there's a whole Hazal that discuss the Timna. There's a whole Hazal that speaks about Timna, who was the Pilegesh of Esav's son Eliphaz. So the whole big, the commentators are go back and forth, like, what's the significance? And they say, no, this is an example. Even Timna, being the concubine of Esav's sons Eliphaz, there's so much to learn from this. It's so important. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin, for example, in Daf Tzadik Tet, it brings down that it's better to be a lowly maidservant to a nation that has blood ties to Israel, that is somewhat related to the Jewish people, than to be a princess, because apparently Timna came from a bit of royalty. So it's better, Timna, the daughter of a nobleman, she chose to demote herself to join the descendants of Abraham, says the Gemara over there. So we even learn from a side little point that, who was his Pilegesh, who was his concubine? That's really important. We learn so much Torah just from that little side point. So who Torah Hashem, K'mo Shema Yisrael, that story, says the Shlach Kadosh, of who the wife of Eliphaz was, that is Torah Hashem equal to Shema Yisrael Hashem Hashem Echad. And he says, if there's something lacking when we read something, what do these words mean? Bemet lo rek mimenu. He says, that's not what's lacking. You know what's lacking? It's me. It's my understanding. I don't understand why it's here right now. So he says, I don't understand what Rashi's saying. He says, what do you mean that the Parshat Bilaam is not necessary for Torah, for Tzorchei Moshe? But everything in the Torah that Hashem said to write in there is for a bigger purpose and has deep ideas. Okay, so without Hashem, we'll get to the Shlach Kadosh at the end of the Dvar Torah. But first off, I want to start off with some simpler interpretations. So we know the Shlach Kadosh is going to tend to go in a mystical approach. So let's first build it up. Let's start with the more pshat approaches. What does it mean that there's a Torah and there's also a Parashat Bilaam? Moshe wrote both. Aren't they the same thing? What's going on? Okay, so it says Sefer Torat Chaim. And he says, actually, he goes with Rashi. He goes, there are parts of the parasha of Bilaam that are not Tzorchei Moshe v'Torah Torah Seder Ma'asav. No, there are parts of the section of Bilaam that really are not necessarily what Moshe was looking to when he was writing the Torah. And he explains as follows. If you look throughout our parasha, we have different prophecies of Bilaam, one after the other. Like Bilaam goes, tries to curse us, blesses us. Balak gets angry. They go to a different part. They try to look at a different glimpse of the Jewish people. Maybe if we offer up other sacrifices, look from a different angle. Maybe now I can curse them. And he opens up his mouth again. A new prophecy comes out. Again, it's a bracha. So says Sefer Torat Chaim, the first three prophecies of Bilaam are Vadai Tzorach HaTorah. He says, Those three for sure, Moshe would need it, the Torah would need it. Why? Because the first three prophecies are blessings for the Jewish people directly. They focus on giving brachot to the Jewish people. Of course, that's tzorchei Moshe, tzorchei Torah. That's not what it means when our Gemara says Parashat Bilaam. Rather, the fourth prophecy that Bilaam gives in our parsha, he begins to speak to the Umot HaOlam, and it's primarily aimed at different nations that are not Jews. It's there for the non-Jewish nations to learn deeper lessons. So he says, this parasha is more tzorech for the rest of the world, for Umot HaOlam, and thus arguably we can say, when we get to the fourth nevuah, that's not tzorech Moshe v'Torato, because tzorech Moshe v'Torato is the concept what's needed just for the Jewish people, very Jewish people oriented. But the fourth prophecy, which deals with the non-Jewish nations, that's also added to the Torah, meaning Hashem still wants it in our Torah, but that's already considered a different level, and that's why the Gemara is telling us, Moshe wrote down the Sifro, and he also added that one section where Bilaam is speaking to the non-Jews of the world. Hashem also wanted him to add that in to our Torah. This also works very well with the continuation of the Gemara, that Moshe also wrote the book of Iyov, because Iyov is a sefer of theology aimed at the world. You know, it seems to be like a story of just non-Jews talking to each other. Yeah, it's not so clear. We'll get to Elihu eventually, who's probably Jewish. It's not clear who is Jewish. Is Eov Jewish? Is he not Jewish? But on the surface level, this seems to just be a story of theology aimed for the non-Jewish world. And actually, the Gemara on the next daf in Tetvav Amud Bet, it counts Bilaam and Eov as two of the seven Nevi'im who were Nevi'im to the non-Jewish nations of the world. So we have ourselves this concept that Parashat Bilaam is the section of the Torah that corresponds to the fourth prophecy of Bilaam, which corresponds to them whose audience is the nations of the world, similar to Sefer Iyov. Hence, it's given a different title than the rest of the Torah. So Moshe Rabbeinu wrote Sifro, which is Jew-centric, along with Parashat Bilaam, meaning the fourth prophecy, which is non-Jewish-centric, as well as Sefer Iyov, which also is theology, philosophy based for the whole entire world. Okay. So that's the first approach of the Torah Chaim. Okay, now let's go to an even simpler approach. Says Rabbeinu Gershom. He explains that what's the chidush of the Gemara is that even though Bilaam is a Navi speaking the word of Hashem, it is Moshe who writes it down and makes it part of the Torah. Meaning Bilaam is speaking Devar Hashem, as we saw in those Midrashim. It's really Devar Hashem. It's a holy level thing, but it doesn't become actual Torah. It doesn't merge with the goof of the Torah until Moshe writes it down. So meaning it's Moshe writing it down that takes the Devar Hashem and makes it into Torah. Similarly, in the Maharal, he also similarly says that this is proof that Hashem allows for the Nevuot of Bilaam to be part of the Holy Torah. If Moshe gets to write it down, then it becomes part of Torah. So meaning, the chidush of the Gemara is that we need Moshe Rabbeinu to write it down into the Torah to make it Torah. Even if you have a Devar Hashem, like the Parashat Bilaam, it only becomes Torah once he writes it down. And once he writes it down, it's proof that Hashem wants it to be Torah. Okay, fine. Says Sefer Nachalat Yaakov. He writes that, this is a fun answer, he says that Bilaam, he's an Aramean, and Balak is Melech Moab. They're not speaking to each other in Lashon HaKodesh. They're not speaking to each other in Hebrew. Hebrew is not their native tongue. It's not their common language. That's not the language they're speaking. Rather, Moshe takes their ideas from their prophecy, and their ideas represent the heights of the Devar Hashem that Bilaam had received from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he writes them down in Lashon HaKodesh, he writes them down in Hebrew, and then when Moshe Rabbeinu converts it into Hebrew, he now fills it with all the proper remazim and the sodot, so that every kotz of every letter, we can be doresh til tilim shel sodot, says the Nachalat Yaakov. So that's the idea, that Moshe Rabbeinu took whatever they were speaking, was it Aramaic, whether they were speaking Moabite, whatever they were speaking to each other, he took the ideas, brought it into the holy tongue, and then infused it with all of the pardes you want to put into the letters of the Torah, and now we can be doresh til tilim shel sodot, says the Nachalat Yaakov. Okay, for a different approach, we have the Iyun Yaakov in the Ein Yaakov. So he says, wait a second, we took a step back and we said, when it says Sifro, what does Sifro mean? Moshe wrote Sifro, that means he wrote the whole Torah. That he wrote Torah Moshe, the whole Torah is named after Moshe. Says the Iyun Yaakov, not exactly. There's actually a different angle. The language of Torah Moshe could mean different things depending who's writing it, what context, what century, what sefer we're talking about. So says the Iyun Yaakov that what Rashi's learning is that there's this thing called Torah Moshe, which refers specifically to Sefer Devarim. Sefer Devarim is known as the Mishnah Torah. It's known as coming more from the words of Moshe Rabbeinu. He says that's Torah Moshe. That's Sifro. Sifro is Sefer Devarim. He says the rest of the Torah is the Torah that predates the world by 2,000 years. As we mentioned in the past, we know the Gemara tells us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the Torah 2,000 years earlier and used it as a blueprint to create the world. So he basically says to Yaakov, the rest of the Torah, meaning the first 4 books of the Torah, that's really the Torah of Hashem. That's the Torah that predated the world. And Sefer Devarim, which is Moshe Rabbeinu's words, that's Torah Moshe. So our Gemara is explaining that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote Sifro, he wrote Torah Moshe, he wrote Sefer Devarim, and he also wrote Parashat Bilaam. What does that mean? Even though Parashat Bilaam is found in Sefer Bamidbar, it's in the 4th book of the Torah, and the 4th book of the Torah will be under what he calls Torah Hashem, and not Torah Moshe, meaning there's Torah, meaning even though Moshe Rabbeinu writes the whole Torah, he writes down all 5 books of Moses, everything's written by Moshe Rabbeinu, but in the language of Torah Hashem, Sifro, the first 4 books would be called Torah Hashem, and the 5th book would be called Torah Moshe. Oh, and I would have thought that Parashat Bilaam is included in the Torah Hashem because it's found in the 4th book. He says, no. He says that is not part of Torah Hashem. Rather, Moshe Rabbeinu wrote that down also because the status of Parashat Bilaam is more similar to the status of Sefer Devarim. Because he says the words of a non-Jewish prophet of Bilaam, that could not have been written directly by Hashem. We can't say that the words of Bilaam is Torah Hashem. No way. You know, if the words of Moshe Rabbeinu in Sefer Devarim is called Sifro, so you should know that so too when it comes to the Parashat Bilaam, Moshe Rabbeinu is writing it down because we couldn't let HaKadosh Baruch Hu be considered the direct redactor of the words that come out of the Tameh mouth of Bilaam. So therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu has the zechut of Sefer Devarim, Sifro, as well as Parashat Bilaam, because Hashem couldn't do that directly. Okay. So those are the simpler approaches. Now, Be'ezrat Hashem, let's try to kick it up a notch. Be'ezrat Hashem. If we open up the Gemara in the Talmud Yerushalmi, there's a similar lashon, a similar language in the Gemara Yerushalmi. This is in Sota Perekei Halacha Vav. Says the Yerushalmi, Moshe katav chamisha sifrei Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu wrote 5 books of the Torah. V'chazar v'katav parashat Balak u'Bilam v'katav sifro shel Iyov. And then he returned, he came back, and then he added the parashiot of Balak and Bilam, and then he also wrote his book of Iyov, of Job. Okay. So, if you notice, there's some slight nuances between our Bavli and this Yerushalmi. Because, first off, in the Yerushalmi, it says that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the Chumash. He wrote Moshe Katav Chamisha Sifrei Torah, and then it says V'chazar V'katav Parashat Balak u'Bilam, and then he returned and it sounds like he added Parashat Balak u'Bilam. So it seems to be a little bit of a chronology over here. If we actually open up the Sefer Marei Panim on the Yerushalmi, he comments as follows: Klomar, Ahar shegamar Chamisha Sifrei Torah milvad Parashat Bilam chazar achar kach v'katav lazeh. Meaning, Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the whole Torah, but he omitted Parashat Bilam. And then after he finished writing the whole Torah, he then went back and he filled in the blanks of what he was missing. He filled in the blanks of the Parashat Bilam. And that's how that's how the Marei Panim learns this Yerushalmi, the Pshat of the Yerushalmi. Now, on a simple level, maybe we could say that why would Moshe Rabbeinu have to go back and add it in? So we could say maybe on a simple level that the story of Balak and Bilam took place outside of Moshe Rabbeinu's direct circle of events. So now it's being plugged back in now. So after Moshe Rabbeinu wrote everything that actually happened to him and the Jewish people, now we're plugging it back in. Actually, if anybody can think of another event since the birth of Moshe Rabbeinu that takes place in the 4 books of the Torah, the last 4 books of the Torah, where Moshe is not like somewhat involved, somewhat around, I'm curious, like, is this on the surface level, like, is this the only story that Moshe Rabbeinu is really not like anywhere near? Like, yeah, we have stories of like Nadav and Avihu, and we have stories of like Korach making rebellion, but it sounds like Moshe Rabbeinu is in the background. He's like somewhere around right now. Now, maybe by the spies, when the spies go in, I don't know. But it still sounds like Moshe Rabbeinu is like very much involved, hearing the story, and he very much knows what's going on. While Balak and Bilam seems to be on the simple level. It's like the one story that was out of Moshe Rabbeinu's realm of events, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is now telling it to him afterwards to plug it back in. Now, there's another nuance between the version of the Yerushalmi and the Bavli. So the Yerushalmi doesn't call it Parashat Bilam, it calls it the Parasha of Balak and Bilam. So it adds Balak into it, which furthers, I think, this idea that Moshe is adding a section of narrative that he wasn't physically a part of. But on this, you can ask a question, but isn't all of Sefer Bereshit? He wasn't around for any of Sefer Bereshit. So also we say, and Moshe Rabbeinu should say, and he wrote Sefer Bereshit. Doesn't say that. So maybe we could say that that Hashem had already given him that Torah earlier. There's different opinions. When did Moshe Rabbeinu write the whole Torah? Did he write it piece by piece from Matan Torah throughout his time in the desert? Did he write it at the end of his life? So it could be that already much earlier on, Hashem had already told him the history of where he came from. Meaning they all had somewhat of a history that they knew. They were passing down. We know the story of Yosef, letting them know when the redemption would be. So they had all these code words, these hints. There was the Brit Ben Betarim. They were always speaking about Abraham and Hashem promising they'd be slaves and go free. So they had a history, they had a tradition, and probably maybe earlier on, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him the earlier stories, and this is only like a later story that's in like contemporary Moshe life that he really wasn't in the vicinity of. But at the end of the day, it's a little bit of a cachet approach because but why did Hashem wait until after he finished writing the Torah to then dictate to him the Balak and Bilaam story? Like now it has to go back. He has to Hazal. He has to go back and add it in. Why add it in? When Moshe Rabbeinu is writing the Torah, when he gets up to the part of Balak and Bilaam, then write that part. Then Hashem should speak to him, say, "Hi, prophecy, Moshe Rabbeinu. This is what happened with Balak and Bilaam." Well, why does he wait to the very end to then go back to add it in? Now, although truthfully, we this could actually be a nice little proof. When it comes to a Sefer Torah, we're more lenient regarding a Sefer Torah about writing a kesidran. Do you have to write it in order or not? Can you make fixes? Can you cut parts out, put things in? When it comes to mezuzah and tefillin, we're very, very strict, and it must be written in the proper order. And any mistake you make, it's pasul from that point on. And but by the Torah, we have more leniency. So here, this might be one of the sources. I was thinking this could be a source because we have over here, Moshe Rabbeinu writing the whole Torah, and then only afterwards Hashem is telling him to add parts earlier on. Although I'm not sure what he does with the actual cloth. He has to add more cloth in over here. Okay, it's everything. But again, notice the nuance of the text. The nuance of the text now, it says that it's Parashat Balak uBilam, but in the Bavli, it only says Parashat Bilaam. So what's that all about? So here's a cool idea I saw. Okay, now let's begin to get a little deeper. Says the Pri Tzaddik. Says Rav Tzaddik HaKohen Milublin. He writes as follows. He jumps on the fact that our Bavli, he doesn't deal with the Yerushalmi at all. He jumps on the Bavli and he says, why does it say only over here Parashat Bilaam? Where did Balak go? Why is it called Parashat Bilaam? So in his Dvar Torah in Pri Tzaddik, is Parashat Yitro Ot Dalet. He sees the omission of Balak from Parashat Bilaam in the Bavli. Moshe Rabbeinu wrote Sifro and Parashat Bilaam. Why is Balak missing? That's Dafka. We Dafka want to be speaking to Bilaam right now, Bilaam by himself. This is not a simple Balak-Bilaam storyline that's missing. Rather, there's something unique in the Torah to Bilaam's teachings, and that's Dafka, what the Gemara is trying to emphasize. There's something called Parashat Bilaam, which is something very deep. Says Rav Tzadok something very, very deep right now. He says, as we mentioned, the Torah predates the world by 2,000 years. But yet we have all these stories of events that take place, of conversations that take place throughout the whole Torah. And that's incorporated into the holy text of the Torah as Moshe writes them down. So when Moshe adds a story into the Torah, it becomes Divrei Torah. He says that's called Torat Moshe. And this should apply to the greater section of Balak and Bilaam as well. Meaning the Balak and Bilaam story, when Moshe Rabbeinu writes it down, then it becomes Divrei Torah. But how does that relate to the idea that, real life chronology events, how could that be part of the Torah if the Torah already existed 2,000 years earlier? It predated the world. It predated even more than that, meaning Moshe Rabbeinu's time. But it predates the entire world by 2,000 years. So he seems to develop this concept. There's a thing called Torat Moshe, and there's this thing called Torat Hashem, Divrei Hashem. He says, Parashat Bilaam, the prophecies of Bilaam, is something different. It's not that Hashem took what Bilaam said. It's not that Moshe took what Bilaam said, writes it down, and then now it becomes Torah. He says there's something much deeper going on over here. Now, Rav Tzadok doesn't really address, let's talk about Torat Moshe versus Torat Hashem, so to speak. How do these numerous stories that take place in real time, how do they merge with the actual Torah to all be called Torah? How do you have a Torah that predated the world and have a Torah of real life events? How does it all become one? What's really going on over there? So I would assume that he would go in the direction of the Ramban, the heavenly Torah of black fire and white fire. We've spoken about this many times in the past, and that the numerous Torah narratives, including the conversations that took place throughout the storylines, and even those conversations that took place from not necessarily the most holy of people, such as he brings down Hagar and Lavan, that they probably, relate to a different form. Like meaning in the earlier Torah that predated it, that's probably the earlier black fire, white fire. It was a different contiguous letters. They were put together in the Shemaim in a different kind of ways. And now when Moshe Rabbeinu includes these stories, of course he's including them al pi Hashem. Hashem is telling him to write down these stories, but now they're becoming part of Torah proper. It's some kind of a mystical merger to the higher level black fire and white fire down below to the actual letters we have below and the commas and the vowels that we put down below. There's some kind of merger taking place between earlier versions and later versions. Ulai, but again, this stuff is a little bit beyond me. Okay, but says Rav Tzadok, regarding the actual prophecies of Bilam, Parashat Bilaam, as our Gemara labels it, he says this Torah Bilam comes from a different, higher level. So it's not just merely Moshe Rabbeinu writing down the event and making it into Torah. The Torah of Bilam comes from a higher place. What does that mean? So he says there's a level known as Devar Hashem. Devar Hashem is the word of Hashem. He says it's a prophecy that Shechina medaberet mitoch grono. As Hazal tell us that the Shechina, the divine presence, is speaking from his throat, meaning it's a God speaking right now. The Midrashim say this level applies only to Moshe and Bilam. Finds in the Zohar as well, that Moshe and Bilam, they have this level of the Shechina speaking from their throat, and therefore Bilam, his prophecy is coming from a certain level of heights. And he says, even though Bilam was lower, when Bilam gives Nebuah, he's ultimately lower than Moshe Rabbeinu, because he didn't have shayachut, nor did he have yedi'ah regarding what Hashem was going to put into his mouth. It sounds like Moshe Rabbeinu knew already what Hashem was going to be giving him, what Hashem was going to be telling him. But the fact that at the end of the day, it is a Devar Hashem coming into his mouth, that already makes it a much higher level than Moshe Rabbeinu recording events that took place. Similarly, says Rav Tzadok in Parashat Matot Ot Chet, in the Pri Tzadik, he says, Omnam ha'inyan ki kol hasipurim shenichtavu b'Torah. He says all the stories written in the Torah, nasa mehem divrei Torah. They became divrei Torah. That Torah nikra sifro de Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom. Ki nikra al shemo Torah Moshe. And the Torah itself, Moshe writes it down. It's now being called the Sefer of Moshe Rabbeinu. It's being called Torah Moshe. Parashat Bilaam, if we skip a little bit now, but Parashat Bilaam, HaNevuot Shamar Hem Me'atzmam Divrei Torah. But he says Parashat Bilaam, they already are Me'atzmam, they themselves are already Divrei Torah. Shemru Hashem Yitbarach, because they came from Hashem Yitbarach. This is totally different to what we saw earlier on that says that even if it's the word of Hashem, it doesn't become Torah until Moshe writes it down. Rav Tzadok says, no, that the Torah of Bilam is a Torah from Hashem directly, because it's mipi grono, it's from the Shekhinah itself. V'lo yedei aktiva b'Torah na'asu divrei Torah. V'al ken lo nechshav zeh b'sefro de Moshe. It's not Moshe writing it down that makes it Torah. It's the fact that it's the word of Hashem that makes it Torah. And therefore, it's not considered to be part of the Sefer of Moshe. Now, it's true, Moshe has the zechut of writing it down, but it's not the Sefer of Moshe. Okay. Now let's get even more deep. Says Rav Tzadok even further. He says, based on the Arizal, Bilam had the koach to reach a level similar to the sinners amongst the Jewish people. The Poshei Yisrael, somehow Bilam was at least attempting to, was trying to, at a certain koach that related to the sinners of the Jewish people, who he says are in the category of Ein Lam Chelek L'Olam Haba. And that's as far as he can get to. He couldn't get any more than that. But in that level, there's something very, very powerful. In fact, in Rav Tzadok way, it could be this one of the greatest heights possible. That Bilam and his Torah seems to relate to the Poshei Yisrael. And he bases this on the Arizal, who comments that in one of Bilam's prophecies, he says, Tamot nafshi mot yesharim. He says, may I die the death of the yesharim, of the upright. Or as some of the commentators say, Yesharim is a hint to Yesharim is Yeshurun. The Jewish people are called Yeshurun. May I die like the Jewish people. Utiach riti kamohu. And let my fate, let my end be like the Jewish people. Meaning he was praying to try to get to this level of the Jewish sinners. And whether he reaches that level or not, it's not clear for me when I read from the Pri Tzadik, but the Jewish sinners do connect to his Torah. Because says Rav Tzadok, we know that every single Jew has a connection to a letter in the Torah. I just want to find my letter in the Torah. I just want to find my letter. Everybody has an ot in the Torah. The letters and psukim of Bilam's prophecies, says Rav Tzadok, these are for the Poshei Yisrael. The sinners of the Jewish people. Where is there the letter in the Torah? Where do sinners have a letter in the Torah? Yes, even the Torah has a letter even for the sinners. And where is their letter? Where is their shorsh neshama? Where does neshama connect to? They ultimately connect to the words and psukim that are in Bilam's prophecies. So the prophecies of Bilam a Poshea Israel connects to those letters, and Rav Tzadok says that ultimately when you have that connection point, you will make it to Olam Haba. You might need a Gilgul, you might need a reincarnation along the way, Ayin Shama, but ultimately you can get to that level. Similarly, says Rav Tzadok in his Sefer Resisei Laila, he writes that in Brachot, Daf Yud Bet, Amud Bet, the Gemara tells us that Hazal had an Havamina. They thought maybe we could add the whole parasha in our parasha into Kriyat Shema. Amar Rabbi Abahu ben Zutarti, Amar Rabbi Yehuda bar Zvida. Okay, they say as follows. Bikshu likboa parashat Balak b'kriyat Shema. The rabbis wanted to add the parasha of Balak into the Kriyat Shema. And why didn't they do it? Mishum Torah Tzibur. Why didn't they add it in that every night, every morning when we say Shema, we all say the whole parasha of Balak? Interesting. Note over here that in this Gemara, it's not called Parashat Bilaam. It's not called Parashat Balak or Bilaam. It's called just Parashat Balak. Okay, but in this case, Rav Tzadok doesn't make a nuanced difference because he's going to go back to speak about the importance of Bilaam. But I think for us, we've seen that there are nuances between them. Interesting that in this Gemara, it's called Parashat Balak and Bilaam is omitted. Okay, but let's leave that to the side. Says Rav Tzadok in this Vasisei Laila that there's a special spiritual energy in Bilam's prophecy that the rabbis wanted to add to our tefillah. Now the Gemara wonders what's so special about this section of the Torah. Why if it would have been shorter, would it have been ideal to say it twice a day with the Shema? So the Gemara goes back and forth. But says the Gemara at one point, Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Abin mishum dechtiva haikra, because one of the psukim in the prophecies of Bilam says kara shachav ka'ari. He crouched down, he lay down like a lion, uchlavi mi yakimenu, and like a lioness, who shall arouse him? So basically, this concept of the lion laying down, how is he going to get up? He's shachab, he's yakimenu. So they explain this is reminiscent to what we see in the Kriyat Shema, uvshoch bechav kumecha, when you lie down and when you rise up. So we have ourselves a little bit of a similarity to the Shema itself, and there seems to be a connection. But ultimately, what's the deeper connection? Okay, very nice. The lion lays down, the lion gets up. We say Shema when we lay down, when we get up. What's the deeper connection? So says Rav Tzadok, says Vasisei Laila, he says, Am Yisrael, even the Posh'im, even the sinners, they have a chelak in Hashem Echad. If we're about to say Kriyat Shema, we have to realize that everybody has a chelak in Kriyat Shema. Even the sinners have a chelak in a Kadosh Baruch Hu. We spoke in the past that Balak and Bilaam, they thought they could really curse the Jewish people because they had gotten a glimpse of Shevet Dan. Shevet Dan was the tribe who had sinned and was spit out of the Arnei HaKavod. They were spit out of the clouds because of their sin. So Balak and Bilaam incorrectly thought that if Hashem kicked them out of the clouds, Hashem abandoned them. In that corner, that katzeh of the machaneh, they're out of the clouds. Now we have a way to grasp onto the Jewish people. We have a spot to curse them. But what ultimately the bracha comes out is that, but even when we're down, we're still the level of the crouching lion. Says Rav Tzadok, this is the whole concept of Kriyat Shema, of when it says when you lay down and when you get up. What does it mean when you lay down, when you get up? Whether we're on the higher level or whether we're on the lower levels, we're down or we're up. We're never disconnected from receiving Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, from taking the yoke of the heaven, from Shema Yisrael, V'Kashrut Yisrael B'Hashem Echad, and the connection point between the Jewish people and Hashem Echad. Even the sinners have that connection point to the Kriyat Shema, and therefore there was a Havamina to place the whole section of Balak, of Bilam, the whole story of our parasha. We would say it together with the Shema twice daily to remind ourselves that every Jew, all Jews, even the Push'im, even the sinners among us, we all have a kesher to Kadosh Baruch Hu. We have all have a kesher to Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim. And when the evil nations think, oh, we got the Jews, we see that they're sinners, we see the Chas Shalom, they're kicked out of the clouds, the parasha is telling us, no, Hashem is always with his Jewish people. So this would have been a perfect intro, I guess, to have more kavanah in the Kriyat Shema. Now, if we turn to the Pri Tzadik on our parasha in Od Bet as well as in Matot Od Chet, he adds based on the Zohar, we actually know it more famously from Pirkei Avot, that the Piha Aton, the donkey's mouth, Bilam's donkey's mouth, was able to speak. That was a miracle, but that was a creation that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created on Erev Shabbat Ben Hashmashot, right between that zone between Friday and Shabbat. It's considered to be a part that's part Chol, a part Kodesh. It's a mystical zone where some very important things were created. One of those things is known as the Piaton. Says Rav Tzadok that the Piaton corresponds to the words of Hashem coming from a very high level. We're talking about the level of prophecy being a Devar Hashem. The fact that that Bilam can speak Devar Hashem, that's all coming back. It all stems. The Shoresh is the Pi Ha'aton, because he says that Bilam's words of prophecy themselves comes from the Koach of Pi Ha'aton. He actually adds pretty sharply that of course Bilam's koach comes from the donkey, because ishto kegufo. The halacha is that the husband and wife share the same the same oneness to them, and we know that Bilam and his donkey had a certain kind of relationship according to Hazal. But as we mentioned a few years ago, the donkey story is a bit of a foreshadowing for the Bilam and Balak story right afterwards. And the Pri Tzadik writes, and this is true on the spiritual level as well, that just as the donkey rebukes Bilam, why did you hit me these shalosh regalim, these 3 times? Bilam is going to try to curse us 3 times, but each time it's going to turn into brachot, and the zechut is hinted to in this language of shalosh regalim, our holy holidays, our mikrei kodesh to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the donkey story is kind of a spiritual background to the actual Bilam story, and Bilam ultimately blessing us. So he says, thus the miracle of the holy words coming out of this tameh donkey corresponds to this holy Dvar Hashem, a level higher than the Siprei Ma'aseh that Moshe needs to elevate to the level of Torah. Meaning, we going back to our Rashi, and our question on Rashi, we have ourselves the Tzorchei Moshe, the Siprei Ma'aseh, that the Pri Tzadik is saying that when Moshe Rabbeinu took stories and he wrote them down, he elevated them to a higher level. He elevates them to the level of Torah. But in the case of Bilam's prophecy, the prophecy is different, because those are divrei Hashem that are coming from the throat of the Tamei Bilam. But that's allowed, and that's a high level. Why? Because that's made possible through the creation of the Piaton Erev Shabbat Ben Hashmashot. This is a holy level creation, and it's a higher level creation. It's a more elevated form, of Devar Hashem that comes from the miraculous creation of the world zone, and that's why it's considered to be separate. We have the Sifra of Moshe Rabbeinu, where he's elevating regular stories, and we have the Parashat Bilaam, which is coming from this Pia Aton, coming from the miraculous Ben Hashmashot. Now, Laniutati, if we take the full picture of the Pri Tzadik, I think he's actually hinting to something much bigger. He doesn't spell it out directly, but if we put this stuff together, he's actually saying something really, really big. He says the level of Torah that comes from Bilam, which is the level of the koach of the tameh aton. It's the level of the words, the holy words coming out of something very impure. This level of Dvar Hashem is very lofty, and as we said, it comes from the Erev Shabbat Ben Hashmashot. This is a very holy zone, but it's coming from a very tameh place. He says Rav Tzadok, this Torah could not be the direct Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, because while Moshe is zocheh to write it, there's a division between Torah Moshe and Parashat Bilaam. Parashat Bilaam is kind of this weird paradox, that it's coming directly from Devar Hashem, but it's also coming from the Tameh Bilaam, so it has a great potential. It's created by Neshmashot, but it also corresponds to the Jewish Poshim, as we said. It corresponds to the Jewish sinners. So as he wrote in his earlier source in Parashat Yitro, the letters in Parashat Bilaam, they correspond to the Jewish sinners. So to this level, Moshe Rabbeinu has no connection to directly. As we mentioned in the past from other sources, the Pri Tzadik writes it as well in a different context in Parashat Yitro at the end of his Otvav. We know of the Sha'ar Nun, the highest gate of wisdom. That corresponds to the level of the Baal Teshuvah. We mentioned in the past, last week's Dvar Torah, there's a bit of a machloket on this, but according to one approach that we found that are brought up by many commentators, the Sha'ar Nun, the highest gate of wisdom, that's the level of the Baal Teshuvah. You need the Teshuvah, probably the Teshuvah Ahava, that's going to convert the sin into mitzvah. You need a certain level to get into the Sha'ar Nun. As Hazal tell us, the makom where a Baal Teshuvah stands, the place that a Baal Teshuvah gets to, a Tzaddik Gamor cannot stand. Moshe Rabbeinu is considered the Tzaddik Gamor. He doesn't relate to the level of the Baal Tshuva, and thus he only grasps 49 levels in his lifetime. So the Torah, this Tameh, Peh Bilam, its root coming from the Pia Aton, Bilam's words, which the Midrash in Devarim Rabbah Perik Aleph Siman Bet calls the Machalik Lashon, the slippery tongue of Bilam, that has the ability through the Koch of Tshuva to reach all the way up to the level of the Sha'ar Nun. So it's these verses that are Sharnun level worthy. And that's why our Gemara is saying that Parashat Bilaam is separate from Torah Moshe. Because while Moshe is Zocher to write it down, this might also explain another answer to how ultimately Rabbi Akiva says the crowns of the letters that Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't understand. Rabbi Akiva being the epitome of the Baal Tshuva, the crowns of the letters that Moshe Rabbeinu is not fully understanding. Oh, it's Halakha Moshe Misinai. What does that mean? But we see over here that Moshe is zocheh to write down this Parashat Bilaam, but it's not directly his. Parashat Bilaam is not Torah Moshe. It's different. It comes from a different source. It comes from a source of Tum'ah being converted into Kedusha. It comes from the source of the Baal Teshuvah. So therefore it comes from the source of the Sharnun, and therefore it's separate from the regular Torah Moshe, which would say gets up to the level of the 49. Okay, let's go back to that beautiful language of the Midrash that speaks about the Machalik Lashon, this slippery tongue. So Hazal tell us that Moshe Rabbeinu was eventually zocheh to the level of dibur. He's going to be the ish devarim in Sefer Devarim. We actually mentioned last week from a Kabbalistic source that it could be that after the hitting of the rock, Moshe Rabbeinu does get to this level of teshuvah, and that's when he actually gets elevated to become this ish dibur, as if he spoke to the rock. Now he finally gets to the level of dibur, but he kind of does it on his own, not with the rest of the Jewish people. Where ultimately he's going to get to that Sharnun on his own. But says the Midrash that when he finally uses his dibur, it's going to be a tough tochacha. He's going to rebuke us at the start of Sefer Devarim. It's tochacha, and it's scary. And what is he doing? He's preparing us, the Jewish people, for Eretz Yisrael. But the Midrash writes that in the end of the day, Moshe's dibur will lead us to chen. It's going to lead us to grace. It's going to have a good outcome. But says the Midrash, the slippery tongue of Bilaam, which makes us sound so awesome and so holy. But says the Midrash, sadly, it also led to our haughtiness. And that's going to lead to the sin at the end of our parasha. When we sin with the Moabite women in Shittim, the daughters of Moab, that's going to be because of the haughtiness we got from the praises of Bilaam. So we mentioned earlier this Gemara that says, Achia Shiloni's curse, to compare us to the Kaneh, was ultimately a bracha, because we know the Kaneh, the reed, it's soft and weak. So even though it's going to fall down with the wind, it's not going to get uprooted. It's going to come right back up. But Bilaam in our parasha, he curses us, or he blesses us, to be like the Eris, to be like the cedar. And while the cedar is strong, the cedar also symbolizes haughtiness. Ultimately, a really strong wind will uproot the cedar, and it's going to be done with. So in a certain sense, the cedar is strong, it looks great, it's awesome, it's praise, it's the brachot of Bilaam. But ultimately came with this errors, the haughtiness, and that haughtiness, says this Midrash, is what led us to be sinning at the end of the parasha. Okay. So that was Rav Tzadok. Rav Tzadok is basically saying Moshe Rabbeinu wrote both. He wrote Torah Moshe, but he also wrote Parashat Bilaam. Parashat Bilaam coming from a different, higher spiritual source than the rest of Torah Moshe. Okay, that's part one. Bezat Hashem. In part two, I want to give over a couple more wilder and mystical approaches. Shabbat Shalom.